Hello, welcome to Heavy Storytelling. Hope you guys enjoy. Make sure to like button, subscribe, hit the bell for this video. My dad is going to be coming up and reading the Bible, and then my sister is going to be doing the synopsis, and then we're going to be reading Great Expectations. I hope you guys enjoy. My dad is going to be coming up right.
Why not? You can do it.
Now? Okay. This way.
Hello. Bow ties are cool. Alright, so let's move this like that. And I've been forgetting to do that do not disturb, which keeps notifications from popping up in the middle of the live stream, which is probably annoying if you're watching it. I don't usually notice it when I'm doing it. So, let me begin. We're in John chapter 5, and this is the English Standard Version. Let me begin. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has five roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath, of course. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing. And greater works than these will he show him, so that you may marvel. For as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. For the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but has passed from death to life. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment. I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. If I alone bear witness about myself, my testimony is not true. There is another who bears witness about me, and I know that the testimony that he bears about me is true. You sent to John, and he has borne witness to the truth. Not that the testimony that I receive is from man, but I say these things so that you may be saved. He was a burning and shining lamp, and you were willing to rejoice for a while in his light. But the testimony that I give is greater than that of John. For the works that the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I am doing, bear witness about me that the Father has sent me. And the Father who sent me has himself borne witness about me. His voice you have never heard, his form you have never seen, and you do not have his word abiding in you, for you do not believe the one whom he has sent. You search the Scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me. Yet you refuse to come to me, that you may have life. I do not receive glory from people, but I know that you do not have the love of God within you. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in my own name, you will receive him. How can you believe when you receive glory from one another, and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, on whom you have set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? That is the reading. I hope that God has blessed you in his reading of the Holy Scripture this evening. So, now we are into Great Expectations. And what happened in the last chapter is they invited Pip over to an old lady, Miss Havisham's house, and she sent him an invitation that said, we intend to serve Pip for dinner. And Pip accepted the invitation, and he was very grateful. And he came over to her house, and then Miss Havisham's granddaughter, Estella, decided that the best way to serve Pip for dinner was to cook him in a pot and eat him. And then they served Pip for dinner. And that was the end of Pip. And here's Kimberly to say what really happened.
Serve Pip for dinner. So what actually happened is Miss Havisham, that's her name?
Something like that.
Yeah, the old lady is exceedingly weird and strange. And she apparently wears only one shoe and a sock on the other foot. That sock has been worn ragged. She's probably not taken it off in, I suspect, half a decade at least. And she wore a white dress that has long since faded to some-ish shade of yellow or cream, but not a nice yellow shade, just dirty, so crazy dirty. And so she eventually got Estella to play with Pip, and they played some game with cards, and Estella was like, oh my gosh, he calls knaves jacks, can you believe it? And she was very rude, but Pip thought she was pretty, and let's see, he eventually sets off on his way home, and the old lady says, when he's about to tell her what day of the week it is currently, when she's about to ask when he's gonna come, well, tell him when he should come next, sorry, he's about to say, oh, it's Wednesday, and she's like, no, I have no need for the days of the week, come in 6 days. And apparently she's forgotten the days of the week as well. And so I think that's about it, yeah. Oh, he has a crisis about how uncultured he is once he gets home as well. And that's about it.
Hi, me again. All right, so we're going to read Great Expectations, Volume 1, Chapters 9 and 10. These are normal length chapters, not the long ones that we had last time. So let's go ahead and get started. When I reached home, my sister was very curious to know all about Miss Havisham's and asked a number of questions. And I soon found myself getting heavily bumped from behind in the nape of the neck and the small of the back, and having my face ignominiously shoved against the kitchen wall because I did not answer those questions at sufficient length. If a dread of not being understood be hidden in the breasts of other young people to anything like the extent to which it used to be hidden in mine, which I consider improbable, as I have no particular reason to suspect myself of having been a monstrosity, it is the key to many reservations. I felt convinced that if I described Miss Havisham's as my eyes had seen it, I should not be understood. Not only that, but I felt convinced that Miss Havisham, too, would not be understood, and although she was perfectly incomprehensible to me, I entertained an impression that there would be something coarse and treacherous in my dragging her, as she really was, to say nothing of Miss Estella, before the contemplation of Mrs. Joe. Consequently, I said as little as I could, and I had my face shoved against the kitchen wall. The worst of it was that the bullying old Pumberchook preyed upon by a devouring curiosity to be informed of all I had seen and heard came gaping over in his chaise cart at tea-time to have the details divulged to him, and the mere sight of the torment, with his fishy eyes and mouth open, his sandy hair inquisitively on end, and his waistcoat heaving with windy arithmetic, made me vicious in my reticence in my reciting. Well, boy, Uncle Pumblechook began, as soon as he was seated in the chair of honor by the fire, how did you get on uptown? I answered, pretty well, sir, and my sister shook her fist at me. Pretty well, Mr. Pumblechook repeated. Pretty well is no answer. Tell us what you mean by pretty well, boy. Whitewash on the forehead hardens the brain into a state of obstinacy, perhaps. Anyhow, with whitewash from the wall on my forehead, my obstinacy was adamantine. I reflected for some time, and then answered as if I had discovered a new idea. I mean, pretty well. My sister, with an exclamation of impatience, was going to fly at me. I had no shadow of defense, for Joe was busy in the forge, when Mr. Pumblechook interposed with, No, don't lose your temper. Leave this lad to me, ma'am. Leave this lad to me. Mr. Pumblechook then turned me toward him, as if he were going to cut my hair, and said, First, to get through our thoughts in order, 43 pence? I calculated the consequences of replying £400, and finding them against me, went as near the answer as I could, which was somewhere about 8 pence off. Mr. Pumblechook then put me through the pence table, from 12 pence make 1 shilling, up to 40 pence make 3 and 4 pence, and then triumphantly demanded, as if he had done for me, now, how much is 43 pence? To which I replied, after a long interval of reflection, I don't know. And I was so aggravated that I almost doubt if I did know. Mr. Pumblechook worked his head like a screw to screw it out of me, and said, Is 43 pence 7 and 6 pence 3 fardens, for instance? Yes, said I, and although my sister instantly boxed my ears, it was highly gratifying to me to see that the answer spoiled his joke and brought him to a dead stop. Boy, what like is Miss Havisham? Mr. Pumblechook began again when he had recovered, folding his arms tight on his chest and applying the screw. Very tall and dark, I told him. Is she, uncle? Asked my sister. Mr. Pumblechook winked assent, from which I had once inferred that he had never seen Miss Havisham, for she was nothing of the kind. Good, said Mr. Pumblechook conceitedly. This is the way to have him. We are beginning to hold our own, I think, mum. I am sure, uncle, returned Mrs. Joe. I wish you had him always. You know so well how to deal with him. Now, boy, what was she doing of when you went in today? Asked Mr. Pumblechook. She was sitting, I answered, in a black velvet coach. Mr. Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe stared at one another, as they well might, and both repeated, In a black velvet coach? Yes, said I, and Miss Estella, that's her niece, I think, handed her in cake and wine in the coach window on a gold plate, and we all had cake and wine on gold plates, and I got up behind the coach to eat mine because she told me to. Was anybody else there? Asked Mr. Pumblechook. 4 dogs, said I. Large or small? Immense, said I, and they fought for veal cutlets out of the silver basket. Mr. Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe stared at one another again in utter amazement. I was perfectly frantic, a reckless witness under the torture, and would have told them anything. Where was this coach, in the name of gracious? Asked my sister. In Miss Havisham's room. They stared again, but there weren't any horses to it. I added this saving clause in the moment of rejecting 4 richly caparisoned coursers, which I had wild thoughts of harnessing. Can this be possible, uncle? Asked Mrs. Joe. What can the boy mean? I'll tell you, Mum, said Mr. Pumblechook. My opinion is it's a sedan chair. She's flighty, you know, very flighty, quite flighty enough to pass her days in a sedan chair. Did you ever see her in it, uncle? Asked Mrs. Joe. How could I? He returned, forced to the admission, when I never see her in my life, never clapped eyes upon her. Goodness, uncle, and yet you've spoken to her. Why, don't you know, said Mr. Pumblechook testily, that when I have been there, I have been took up to the outside of her door, and the door has stood ajar, and she has spoke to me that way. Don't say you don't know that, Mum. Howsever, the boy went there to play. What did you play at, boy? We played with flags, I said. I beg to observe that I think of myself with amazement when I recall the lies I told on this occasion. Flags? Echoed my sister. Yes, said I. Estella waved a blue flag, and I waved a red one, and Miss Havisham waved one sprinkled all over with little gold stars out of the coach window, and then we all waved our swords and hurrahed. Swords, repeated my sister. Where did you get swords from? Out of the cupboard, said I, and I saw pistols in it, and jam and pills, and there was no daylight in the room, but it was all lighted up with candles. That's true, Mum, said Mr. Pumblechook with a grave nod. That's the state of the case, for that much I've seen myself. And then they both stared at me, and I, with an obtrusive show of artlessness on my countenance, stared at them, and plaited the right leg of my trousers with my right hand. If they had asked me any more questions, I should undoubtedly have betrayed myself, for I was even then on the point of mentioning that there was a balloon in the yard, and should have hazarded the statement but for my invention being divided between the phenomenon and a bear in the brewery. They were so much occupied, however, in discussing the marvels I had already presented for their consideration that I escaped. The subject still held them when Joe came in with his work to have a cup of tea, to whom my sister, more for the relief of her own mind than for the gratification of his, related my pretended experiences. Now, when I saw Joe open his blue eyes and roll them all round the kitchen in helpless amazement, I was overtaken by the penitence, but only as regarded him, not in the least as regarded the other two. Toward Joe, and Joe only, I considered myself a young monster, while they sat debating what results would come to me from Miss Havisham's acquaintance and favor. They had no doubt that Miss Havisham would do something for me. Their doubts related to the form that something would take. My sister stood out for property. Mr. Pumblechook was in favor of a handsome premium for binding me apprentice to some genteel trade, say the corn and the seed trade, for instance. Joe fell into the deepest disgrace with both for offering the bright suggestion that I might only be presented with one of the dogs who had fought for the veal cutlets. If a fool's head can't express better opinions than that, said my sister, and you have got any work to do, you had better go and do it. So he went. After Mr. Pumblechook had driven off, and when my sister was washing up, I stole into the forge to Joe and remained by him until he had done for the night. Then I said, "Before the fire goes out, Joe, I should like to tell you something." "Should you, Pip?" Said Joe, drawing his shoeing stool near the forge. "Then tell us, what is it, Pip?" "Joe," said I, taking hold of his rolled-up shirt-sleeve and twisting it between my finger and thumb, "you remember all that about Miss Havisham's?" "Remember?" said Joe. "I believe you. Wonderful." "It's a terrible thing, Joe. It ain't true." "What are you telling of, Pip?" cried Joe, falling back in the greatest amazement. "You don't mean to say it's—" "Yes, I do. It's lies, Joe." "But not all of it. Why, sure you don't mean to say, Pip, that there was no black velvet coat, eh?" For I stood shaking my head. "But at least there was dogs, Pip." "Come, Pip," said Joe persuasively. "If there weren't no veal cutlets, at least there was dogs." "No, Joe." "A dog?" said Joe. "A puppy? Come." "No, Joe, there was nothing at all of the kind." As I fixed my eyes hopelessly on Joe, Joe contemplated me in dismay. "Pip, old chap, this won't do, old fellow, I say. Where do you expect to go to?" "It's terrible, Joe, ain't it?" "Terrible?" cried Joe. "Awful! What possessed you?" "I don't know what possessed me, Joe," I replied, letting his shirt-sleeve go, and sitting down in the ashes at his feet, hanging my head. "But I wish you hadn't taught me to call knaves at cards jacks, and I wish my boots weren't so thick nor my hands so coarse." And then I told Joe that I felt miserable, and that I hadn't been able to explain myself to Mrs. Joe and Mr. Pumblechook, who were so rude to me, and that there had been a beautiful young lady at Miss Havisham's who was really dreadfully proud, and that she had said I was common, and that I knew I was common, and that I wished I was not common, and that the lies had come of it somehow, though I don't know how. This was the case of metaphysics, at least as difficult for Joe to deal with as for me. But Joe took the case altogether out of the region of metaphysics, and by that means vanquished it. "There's one thing you may be sure of, Pip," said Joe, after some rumination, "namely, that lies is lies. Howsever they come, they didn't ought to come, and they come from the father of lies, and work round to the same. Don't you tell no more of 'em, Pip. That ain't the way to get out of being common, old chap. And as to being common, I don't make it out at all clear. You are uncommon in some things. You are uncommon small. Likewise, you are an uncommon scholar." "No, I'm ignorant and backward, Joe." "Why, see what a letter you wrote last night. Wrote in print, even. I seen letters. Ah! And from gentlefolks. That I'll swear weren't wrote in print," said Joe. "I have learnt next to nothing, Joe. You think much of me. It's only that." "Well, Pip," said Joe, "be it so or be it so'n't. You must be a common scholar afore you can be an uncommon one, I should hope. The king upon his throne, with the crown upon his head, can't sit and write his acts of parliament in print without having begun when he were an unpromoted prince with the alphabet, ha?" added Joe with a shake of his head that was full of meaning, "and begun at A, too, and worked all his way to Z, and I know what that is to do, though I can't say I've exactly done it." There was some hope in this price of wisdom, and it rather encouraged me. "Whether common ones as to callings and earnings," pursued Joe reflectively, "mightn't be the better of continuing for to keep company with common ones, instead of going out to play with uncommon ones, which reminds me to hope that there were a flag, perhaps." "No, Joe. I'm sorry there weren't a flag, Pip. Whether that might be or mightn't be is a thing as can't be looked into now, without putting your sister on the rampage, and that's a thing not to be thought of as being done intentional. Look'ee here, Pip, as what is said to you by a true friend, which is that you, the true friend, say. which this to you the true friends say. If you can't get to be uncommon through going straight, you'll never get to do it through going crooked. So don't tell no more on 'em, Pip, and live well and die happy. You're not angry with me, Joe? No, old chap, but bearing in mind that them were which I mean to say of a stunning and audacious sort, alluding to them which bordered on veal cutlets and dog-fighting, a sincere well-wisher would advise, Pip, their being dropped into your meditations when you go upstairs to bed. That's all, old chap. And don't never do it no more. When I got up to my little room and said my prayers, I did not forget Joe's recommendation, and yet my young mind was in that disturbed and unthankful state that I thought long after I laid me down how common Estella would consider Joe, a mere blacksmith, how thick his boots and how coarse his hands. I thought how Joe and my sister were then sitting in the kitchen, and how I had come up to bed from the kitchen, and how Miss Havisham and Estella never sat in a kitchen, but were far above the level of such common doings. I fell asleep recalling what I used to do when I was at Miss Havisham's, as though I had been there weeks or months instead of hours, and as though it were quite an old subject of remembrance instead of one that had arisen only that day. That was a memorable day to me, for it made great changes in me, but it is the same with any life. Imagine one selected day struck out of it, and think how different its course would have been. Pause, you who read this, and think for a moment of the long chain of iron or gold or thorns or flowers that would never have been bound you but for the formation of the first link on one memorial day. So we're going to pause here. Okay, now it's time for chapter 10. The felicitous idea occurred to me a morning or two later when I woke, that the best step I could take toward making myself uncommon was to get out of Biddy everything she knew. By the way, every time that Joe said uncommon, it was spelled with an O, and I had no idea how to pronounce it, so I just said uncommon, but it was like uncommon or something. Anyway, sorry. In pursuance of this luminous conception, I mentioned to Biddy, when I went to Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt's at night, that I had a particular reason for wishing to get on in life, and that I should feel very much obliged to her if she would impart all her learning to me. Biddy, who was the most obliging of girls, immediately said she would, and indeed began to carry out her promise within 5 minutes. The educational scheme or course established by Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt may be resolved into the following synopsis. The pupils ate apples and put straws down one another's backs, until Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt collected her energies and made an indiscriminate totter at them with a birch rod. After receiving the charge with every mark of derision, the pupils formed in line and buzzingly passed a ragged book from hand to hand. The book had an alphabet in it, some figures and tables, and a little spelling, that is to say, it had had once. As soon as this volume began to circulate, Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt fell into a state of coma, arising either from sleep or rheumatic paroxysm. The pupils then entered among themselves upon a competitive examination on the subject of boots, with the view of ascertaining who could tread the hardest upon whose toes. This mental exercise lasted until Biddy made a rush at them and distributed 3 defaced Bibles, shaped as if they had been unskilfully cut off the chump end of something, more illegibly printed at the best than any curiosities of literature I have since met with, speckled all over with iron mold and having various specimens of the insect world smashed between their leaves. This part of the course was usually lightened by several single combats between Biddy and refractory students. When the fights were over, Biddy gave out the number of a page, and then we all read aloud what we could or what we couldn't in a frightful chorus, Biddy leading with a high, shrill, monotonous voice, and none of us having the least notion of or reverence for what we were reading about. When this horrible din had lasted a certain time, it mechanically awoke Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt, who staggered at a boy fortuitously and pulled his ears. This was understood to terminate the course for the evening, and we emerged into the air with shrieks of intellectual victory. It was fair to remark that there was no prohibition against any pupil's entertaining himself with a slate or even with the ink when there was any, but that it was not easy to pursue that branch of study in the winter season, on account of the little general shop in which the classes were holden, and which was also Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt's sitting-room and bedchamber, being but faintly illuminated through the agency of one low-spirited dip candle and no snuffers. It appeared to me that it would take time to become uncommon under these circumstances. Nevertheless, I resolved to try it, and that very evening Biddy entered on our special agreement by imparting some information from her little catalogue of prices under the head of moist sugar, and leading me to copy at home a large old English D, which she had imitated from the heading of some newspaper, and which I supposed, until she told me what it was, to be a design for a buckle. Of course there was a public house in the village, and of course Joe liked sometimes to smoke his pipe there. I had received strict orders from my sister to call for him at the Three Jolly Bargemen that evening on the way from school, and bring him home at my peril. To the Three Jolly Bargemen, therefore, I directed my steps. There was a bar at the Jolly Bargemen, with some alarmingly long chalk scores in it on the wall at the side of the door, which seemed to me to be never paid off. They had been there ever since I could remember, and had grown more than I had, but there was a quantity of chalk about our country, and perhaps the people neglected no opportunity of turning it to account. It being Saturday night, I found the landlord looking rather grimly at those records, but as my business was with Joe and not with him, I merely wished him good evening, and passed into the common room at the end of the passage, where there was a bright, large kitchen fire, and where Joe was smoking his pipe in company with Mr. Wopsle and a stranger. Joe greeted me as usual with, "Hello, Pip, old chap," and the moment he said that, the stranger turned his head and looked at me. He was a secret-looking man whom I'd never seen before. His head was all on one side, and one of his eyes was half shut, as if he were taking aim at something with an invisible gun. He had a pipe in his mouth, and he took it out, and after slowly blowing all his smoke away, and looking hard at me all the time, nodded. So I nodded, and then he nodded again, and made room on the settle beside him that I might sit down there. But as I was used to sit beside Joe whenever I entered that place of resort, I said, "No, thank you, sir," and I felt into the space Joe made for me on the opposite settle. The strange man, after glancing at Joe and seeing that his attention was otherwise engaged, nodded to me again when I had taken my seat, and then rubbed his leg in a very odd way as it struck me. You was saying," said the strange man, turning to Joe, "that you was a blacksmith?" "Yes, I said it, you know," said Joe. "What do you drink, Mr. You didn't mention your name, by the by." Joe mentioned it now, and the strange man called him by it. "What do you drink, Mr. Gargery, at my expense, to top up with?" "Well," said Joe, "to tell you the truth, I ain't much in the habit of drinking at anybody's expense but my own." "Habit? No," returned the stranger, "but once in a way, and on a Saturday night too. Come, put a name to it, Mr. Gargery." "I wouldn't wish to be stiff company," said Joe. "Rum." "Rum?" repeated the stranger. "And will the other gentleman originate a sentiment?" "Rum," said Mr. Wopsle. "3 rums," cried the stranger, calling to the landlord. "Glasses round." "This other gentleman," observed Joe, by way of introducing Mr. Wopsle, is the gentleman that you would like to hear give it out, our clerk at church. Aha, said the stranger, quickly and cocking his eye at me. The lonely church right out on the marshes with graves round it. That's right, said Joe. The stranger, with a comfortable kind of grunt over his pipe, put his legs up on the settle that he had to himself. He wore a flapping, broad-brimmed traveller's hat, and under it a handkerchief tied over his head in the manner of a cap, so that he showed no hair. As he looked at the fire, I thought I saw a cunning expression, followed by a half-laugh, come into his face. I am not acquainted with this country, gentlemen, but it seems a solitary country toward the river. Most marshes is solitary, said Joe. No doubt, no doubt. Do you find any gypsies now, or tramps, or vagrants, or any sort out there? No, said Joe. None but a runaway convict now and then. And we don't find them easy, eh, Mr. Wopsle? Mr. Wopsle, with a majestic remembrance of old discomfiture, assented, but not warmly. Seems you have been out after such? Asked the stranger. Once, returned Joe. Not that we wanted to take them, you understand. We went out as lookers-on, me and Mr. Wopsle and Pip, didn't us, Pip? Yes, Joe. The stranger looked at me again, still cocking his eye, as if he were expressly taking aim at me with his invisible gun, and said, He's a likely young parcel of bones, that. What is it you call him? Pip, said Joe. Christened Pip? No, not christened Pip. Surname Pip? No, said Joe. It's a kind of a family name, what he gave himself when an infant, and is called by. Son of yours? Well, said Joe, meditatively, not, of course, that he could be in any wise necessary to consider about it, but because it was the way at the Jolly Bargeman to seem to consider deeply about everything that is discussed over pipes. Well, no, he ain't. Nevy? Said the strange man. Well, said Joe, with the same appearance of profound cogitation, he is not, no, not to deceive you, he is not my nevy. What the blue blazes is he? Asked the stranger, which appeared to me to be an inquiry of unnecessary strength. Mr. Wopsle struck in upon that, as one who knew all about relationships, having professional occasion to bear in mind what female relations a man might not marry, and expounded the ties between me and Joe. Having his hand in, Mr. Wopsle finished off with a most terrifically snarling passage from Richard III, and seemed to think he had done quite enough to account for it when he added, as the poet says. And here I may remark that when Mr. Wopsle referred to me, he considered it a necessary part of such reference to rumple my hair and poke it into my eyes. I cannot conceive why everybody of his standing who visited at our house should always have to put me through the same inflammatory process under similar circumstances. Excuse me. Yet I do not call to mind that I was ever in my earlier youth the subject of remark in our social family circle, but some large-handed person took some such ophthalmic steps to patronize me. All this while the strange man looked at nobody but me, and looked at me as if he were determined to have a shot at me at last and bring me down. But he said nothing after offering his blue blazes observation until the glasses of rum and water were brought, and then he made his shot, and a most extraordinary shot it was. It was not a verbal remark, but a proceeding in dumb show, and was pointedly addressed to me. He stirred his rum and water pointedly at me, and he tasted his rum and water pointedly at me, and he stirred it and he tasted it, not with a spoon that was brought to him, but with a file. He did this so that nobody but I saw the file, and when he had done it, he wiped the file and put it in a breast pocket. I knew it to be Joe's file, and I knew that he knew my convict the moment I saw the instrument. I sat gazing at him, spellbound, but he now reclined on the settle, taking very little notice of me and talking principally about turnips. There was a delicious sense of cleaning up and making a quiet pause before going on in life afresh in our village on Saturday nights, which stimulated Joe to dare to stay out half an hour longer on Saturdays than at other times. The half hour and the rum and the water running out together, Joe got up to go and took me by the hand. "Stop half a minute, Mr. Gargery," said the strange man. "I think I've got a bright new shilling somewhere in my pocket, and if I have, the boys shall have it." He looked it out from a handful of small change, folded it in some crumpled paper, and gave it to me. "Yours," said he. "Mind, your own." I thanked him, staring at him far beyond the bounds of good manners and holding tight to Joe. He gave Joe good night, and he gave Mr. Wopsle good night, who went out with us, and he gave me only a look with his aiming eye. No, not a look, for he shut it up, but wonders may be done with an eye by hiding it. On the way home, if I had been in a humour for talking, the talk must have been all on my side, for Mr. Wopsle parted from us at the door of the Jolly Bargeman, and Joe went all the way home with his mouth wide open to rinse the rum out with as much air as possible. But I was in a manner stupefied by this turning up of my old misdeed and old acquaintance, and could think of nothing else. My sister was not in a very bad temper when we presented ourselves in the kitchen, and Joe was encouraged by that unusual circumstance to tell her about the bright shilling. "A bad 'un, I'll be bound," said Mrs. Joe triumphantly, "or he wouldn't have given it to the boy. Let's look at it." I took it out of the paper, and it proved to be a good one. "But what's this?" said Mrs. Joe, throwing down the shilling and catching up the paper. "2 one-pound notes?" Nothing less than 2 fat, sweltering 1-pound notes that seemed to have been on terms of the warmest intimacy with all the cattle markets in the country. Joe caught up his hat again and ran with them to the Jolly Bargeman to restore them to their owner. While he was gone, I sat down on my usual stool and looked vacantly at my sister, feeling pretty sure that the man would not be there. Presently Joe came back, saying that the man was gone, but that he, Joe, had left word at the 3 Jolly Bargemen concerning the notes. Then my sister sealed them up in a piece of paper and put them under some dried rose leaves in an ornamental teapot on the top of a press in the state parlour. There they remained, a nightmare to me many a night and day. I had sadly broken sleep when I got to bed, through thinking of the strange man taking aim at me with his invisible gun, and of the guiltily coarse and common thing it was to be on secret terms of conspiracy with convicts, a feature in my low career that I had previously forgotten. I was haunted by the file, too. A dread possessed me that when I least expected it, the file would reappear. I coaxed myself to sleep by thinking of Miss Havisham's next Wednesday, and in my sleep I saw the file coming at me out of a door without seeing who held it, and I screamed myself awake. That's the end of chapter 10. So next time we'll get into chapter 11, and I look forward to it. I hope you're enjoying Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, and we will read on next time. God bless you. Have a great night.